Hi, I'm Swedge, and welcome to my chronomancer dual-incinerate build guide. I'm going to explain my build to you while I AFK in this level 80 corruption trial. I sure hope nothing untoward happens while I do. As you've just seen, this build can easily handle +4 pinnacle bosses with a single ignite, and it can map quite efficiently. So can many other builds, but not too many could also do something like this. While Chronomancer is an underpowered ascendancy on the whole, it alone has the power to fully leverage Recoup to become almost unkillable while mapping, emphasis on the almost, and acquire sustain other specs can only dream of. With the new Sacrosanctum unique chest allowing energy shield to recoup, you get to leverage the power of ES builds in stacking huge amounts of EHP. The few uniques this build needs are very budget friendly, none of them costing more than a few exalts, and it's capable of using relatively unwanted armor ES bases effectively, letting you gear cheaply. It also only requires 4 ascendancy points to come online, although Sacrosanctum's level 68 requirement means you'll have to wait until early maps to really get your sustain engine going. As you'll see, it maps comfortably, bosses comfortably, and if you enjoy playing off-meta builds and hate dying, you might want to check this out. Okay, great. It looks like I'm still alive. I guess on with the rest of the video. First, let's look at the skill setup. As I alluded to in the intro, this is a dual-incinerate build, one for single target damage and one for easy mapping. There's some great advantages to using the same skill for bossing and mapping. You scale their damage in similar ways, and both will benefit from a Prism of Belief unique duel. These are very expensive for Incinerate, but don't worry, you don't need them to break 2 million ignite DPS on single target. Some people might balk at the idea of using a channeled skill like Incinerate for mapping, but this setup means you only ever cast it for a few ticks, then move on. We use Wildfire support, buffed in Dawn of the Hunt, to spread the ignite rapidly across the screen. We pair this with Fiery Death, which means that 60% of the enemies killed will explode for 10% of their max health, scaling with your damage modifiers and also triggering the Wildfire proliferation. This results in a very satisfying playstyle that's reminiscent of Essence Drain, Contagion, Chaos builds. I support this with mobility to reduce the movement speed penalty from casting. The remaining slots are somewhat open. If your damage levels are low, you can run a damage support here, like Controlled Destruction or Fire Mastery, or both. If you find the damage is enough to clear comfortably, consider the following. Inspiration to keep costs low, especially relevant if you're stacking many sources of plus spell skills. Magnified Effect to give you slightly more area of effect. This is especially good in content where enemies spawn in around you like Ritual Expedition or, as you can see here, Strongboxes, where the ignited ground Incinerate leaves at full stacks can kill enemies as they spawn in around you. Or Unbreakable, to prevent any light stuns from slowing you down. This is more relevant at lower outgoing damage earlier in the build, where you'll need to stack Incinerate slightly higher to set off a big prolific ignite, but can be dropped later on. For Spirit Gems, we focus on mobility and survivability. Blink works wonderfully with Chronomancer's cooldown resets, keeping you mobile. It also pairs well with the playstyle. Blink into a pack, spread some ignite, and blink to the next. Everything will die behind you as the ignites and Fiery Death explosions chain together. We also run a Temporal Chains Curse with Blasphemy support. This stacks with Chronomancer's Apex of the Moment, meaning normal enemies will have their actions and movement speed slowed by over 40%. This really synergizes with the Recoup based playstyle, and also works well with their Ignite prolifs, keeping enemies bunched up for longer due to their slow movement speed. Now let's look at the skill setup for bossing. We make full use of both weapon skill sets. The first is for mapping and for casting our single target Incinerate, investing heavily into Ignite Magnitude and critical damage multiplier. As Incinerate is a sustained skill, rolling crit on each tick, and you only need 1 tick to crit to roll a crit ignite across the full duration, you don't have to invest into crit strike chance. The second weapon set has several purposes. First, it applies a magnified Flammability Curse. Secondly, it invests heavily into critical strike chance to shock on the boss with low-level ball lightning, doing 2 things. It applies critical weakness via the Effigy of Cruelty unique focus, allowing Incinerate to crit. And secondly, it refreshes our ignite via the Total Incineration Tree passive, which refreshes all ignites on the target upon critical hits. Finally, it uses the Scyther's unique spear to easily aggravate the ignite on the boss, doubling the ignite's damage. It's important to note that with enough damage when fighting regular map bosses, even level 82 ones at +4 difficulty, you can just stack Incinerate on the boss, aggravate the ignite, and let it burn down. Your damage is high enough that the fight's already over. The Ignite Refresh is only really relevant at +3 or +4 pinnacle bosses, who can have enough HP to not die in a single, regular duration ignite. My incinerate setup looks like this. First, Eternal Flame to ensure the ignites last long enough on pinnacle bosses for me to safely aggravate and refresh the ignite without it falling off. This also ensures that regular map bosses all comfortably die in a single ignite, even at level 82 with +4 difficulty. Second, Searing Flame. Early on in the build, you might skip this for another support gem applying a generic more damage modifier. Later on in the build, once you've stacked some ignite magnitude, this gem becomes huge. It supplies a 75% more, i.e. multiplicative modifier, making all other sources of ignite magnitude better. This is by far the highest damage support gem in my setup, providing something like a 45% more modifier overall, even with the diminished hit damage. Third, I run Burgeon, which supplies a generic 40% more damage multiplier once you've cast Incinerate for up to 4 seconds. You might not even need the full benefit of this gem on regular map bosses, something like 2 seconds casting for 20% is often more than enough. Fourth, I use Considered Casting, which gives a 35% more damage modifier in exchange for 15% less casting speed. While this does make Incinerate stack slower, you should still hit the full exposure intensity of the skill within the 4-second Burgeon requires you to cast anyway. Incinerate's mana cost also scales with cast speed, making it cheaper to channel with this gem plugged in, offsetting any increased mana consumption that may have arisen from a longer channel. Finally, Super Critical. While other options do exist for more generic damage here, like Concentrated Effect, this is almost as good and comes with no meaningful downside. You still crit with very high regularity once critical weakness is applied, even with the crit chance penalty of Super Critical. This gem is especially good before you get high crit damage multiplier investment from the passive tree and from your gear elsewhere. The bossing rotation is as follows. First, cast Ball Lightning on the target at close range to stack critical weakness. Second, cast your Flammability Curse. Because we're a dual curse setup, this has a delayed activation that works in our favour, delaying curse application until our Incinerate is stacked up and doing damage. Third, channel Incinerate. As it requires Incinerate skill stacks and Burgeon stacks, its damage increases. Once at 8 stacks, it starts applying fire exposure to the target, 8% per stack, up to 50%, stacking with the resistance reduction from Flammability, and both able to bring resistances negative. Fourth, cast Rapid Assault at the target. Rapid Assault is supported by Lacerate to increase the bleed chance, as it needs to aggravate a bleed to aggravate the ignite, Martial Tempo for quicker skill usage, and Bullseye to mean that even without meaningful investment into melee skills, we can still hit 85% accuracy. Usually one cast of Rapid Assault is sufficient to aggravate the ignite. Fifth, if the boss is a regular map boss, it's already dead. If you're facing off against an Uber Pinnacle, you'll want to periodically shotgun Ball Lightning into the boss to refresh your ignite. You can also recast Flammability if it falls off, as ignite damage changes dynamically with target effects. You can also use a low-level Incinerate paired with Strip Away and Arcane Tempo to quickly reapply fire exposure, even bringing up to 60% intensity. Repeat until the Pinnacle boss is dead. Now we're going to do a deep dive on how a Recoup-based sustain engine works. If you're not too bothered by the particulars, then you can skip ahead to the gear breakdown at the next chapter mark. Recoup is the single reason why this build is run on a Chronomancer. Chronomancer gets access to the Rapid River Ascendancy notable, reducing the time over which Recoup effects occur from 8 seconds to just 4 seconds. This can be further reduced with the pliable Fresh Tree notable, resulting in a 3.2 seconds total Recoup time. Life Recoup on its own is not that powerful. Only having a single layer of defensive resource being recouped makes you vulnerable. If you're running pure life recoup, when you take a big hit, you're on low life and the recoup is going to take some time to heal you back up, leaving you in danger. With a dual life ES recoup strategy enabled by Sacrosanctum, your life is incredibly well protected. If your ES ever gets broken, your life is protected not just by your life recoup, which will have already stacked to high levels by the time ES is broken, it's also being offset by your ES recoup, giving you double the effective sustain to deal with subsequent incoming damage. Dual Recoup also offers a new avenue to effectively scale your recoup. By taking Energy Shield Bypass, you can let your very well protected life absorb some of the damage your ES would otherwise have taken, letting your ES sustain itself incredibly well, even under heavy fire. With the At-Series Disdain Unique Helm, which offers a huge amount of synergistic ES scaling with max life, and the Heavy Buffer Tree passive, you can acquire 15% bypass and even more with that series corruptions. My current bypass of 17% gives my ES recoup an effective 20.5% bonus because of that damage that is offset onto my life, which is easily recovered via life recoup. We have not only this, but the Soul Bloom passive, giving 15% energy shield recovery rate. Recovery rate for generic resources doesn't alter the time over which the effects occur, but boosts the recovery magnitude. Combined with Bypass, these let your effective ES recoup reach ridiculous levels without too much investment on the tree. Here's a breakdown of my current sources of life recoup. The primary ones are tree passives, jewels, the Sacrosanctum affix and its corruption, and my amulet affix. This gives me a total of 111% life recoup if I'm not taking chaos damage, 96% if so. The Glazed Flesh node gives another 3% flat ES recoup, giving 114% ES recoup total. This is boosted by Soul Bloom by 15% up to 131%. Then when we consider 17% ES bypass, the effective ES recoup in total is 158%. This means that when I take hit damage, my energy shield recoups the full loss in just 2 seconds, with anything for the next 1.2 seconds becoming actual healing. This is particularly powerful because Recoup does not stop recovering when your resource is full, protecting you against subsequent hits even when you've fully recovered your ES. This setup does not quite make you immortal. You're still very vulnerable to short bursts of damage from multiple sources when you're hitting a new pack and don't have ES recouped already. But with almost 7k total ES in life, it's incredibly hard for enemies to burst through your EHP before the Recoup kicks in and heals you right back up. This setup is incredibly comfortable while mapping and bossing, and is easily worth the trade-off in offensive power that you take when you ascend to Chronomancer. As alluded to previously, the build uses a handful of very accessible uniques. In the chest slot, Sacrosanctum is build defining, letting our life recoup also apply to our energy shield. This is the only way to accumulate any significant degree of ES recoup, so it's a non-negotiable. Thankfully, Sacrosanctum is quite a high level chest, supplying 2 attributes you're in need of, Chaos Res and Spirit. It also packs a decent amount of armor in ES, so despite being a cheap unique, it's not a dead slot for your defenses by any means. In terms of unique corruptions, hitting the life recoup enchant is very strong, letting you divert passive points in the tree into more damage or max ES, but other enchants in extra sockets are cheaper and very useful. At Series Disdain in the Helm socket is strongly recommended for 2 reasons. The first is the aforementioned ES bypass, which effectively scales your overall ES recoup. Secondly, as a dual life and ES recoup build, we stack life. Point for point, life is more valuable than ES because when your life is exposed, you're benefiting from dual life and ES recovery and restoring resource before subsequent damage arrives. As such, the unique affix on its series that scales your ES based on your max life is very valuable. On my current build, it's supplying almost 1800 ES, and as a bonus, it also packs item rarity. For corruptions, getting more ES bypass and more life to ES scaling are both excellent, although 2 sockets is also a very solid corrupt. Midnight Braid is technically optional. The mana concerns of this build are largely met with flasks and natural regeneration, but Midnight Braid lets you spam abilities while mapping and not really be concerned about resources. If your mana needs are met, you can drop Midnight Braid for a plate belt with good armor, life, and resistance affixes. This can lessen the affix pressure on your other rare gear in helpful ways, letting you use cheaper pieces elsewhere. If you run Midnight Braid, the corruption enchant for % increased max ES globally is very solid. For the weapon swap, 2 uniques are used. Scythe's Spear is used purely to bleed enemies and aggravate those bleeds, to also aggravate your ignites on bosses. A chance to bleed soul core is run here in the socketable, you of course don't care about damage. For corruptions, reduced attribute requirements can be helpful to drop some dex, as Scythes requires more dex to use than minimum level rapid assault gem. Increased attack speed is also fine. 2 sockets or increased rolls on chances to bleed and aggravate would also be useful, but I stress this is a very marginal min-max. Finally, we have the Effigy of Cruelty focus. Its only job is to let your ball lightning orbs apply critical weakness, so you really want one with 5 stack application on crit. For corrupts, the only usable result is an additional socket. The % increased ES enchant is local, not global, so the tiny amount of ES on this focus isn't worth boosting. Let's take a look at your stat pros and the rest of the gear slots. With regards to resistances, you want all 4 capped. Some builds skimp on chaos resistance, but remember the ES takes double damage from chaos, and this is a build all about face tanking damage. Trust me that it feels much better with unconditionally capped chaos res. To round out your defenses, you want lots of max life, energy shield, and some armor. My build runs around 1500 armor, which does very little against big physical hits, but provides a decent DR against the flood of smaller hits you take while mapping, letting the recoup bank up before you get overwhelmed. It's possible this build feels better with pure ES items, but for now, armor and ES feels great to me. For offense, this varies per slot. Cast speed does relatively little for you and can be safely ignored. Your rings can roll increased fire damage, this is a nice luxury to have. For your gloves, crit damage is a solid damage affix. For the wand, you ideally want +5 level to fire spells, but don't ignore wands that only have +4, some of them have other stats that are so strong they beat out +5 wands. For extra damage affixes, only gain % fire damage as extra fire damage works with Incinerate, the lightning cold ones do nothing. This lets you focus on cheaper wands that have good fire damage or spell damage rolls. Crit damage is great here, as is mana on kill to help smooth out mapping. Crit chance isn't much help given we're almost guaranteed to roll a crit tick on Incinerate, even with just the base 10% from critical weakness. In terms of corrupt, +1 to fire spell skills is the dream. For your focus, +2 to all spell skills is a huge damage increase and is the priority. For prefixes, you want high flat and %ES, with high fire or spell damage running at the third. For your remaining 2 suffixes, the only one that meaningfully rescales your damage is crit damage bonus. This leaves one free affix to pick up some intelligence or shore up resistance. For corrupts, another socket or increased local %ES would be great. The amulet is a very powerful slot for this build. Life Recoup is only available on rare gear as an amulet suffix, same for mana recoup. A high life recoup roll and +3 spell skills are desirable, but on a budget, a +2 spell skills amulet will suffice. If you want to drop Midnight Braid, you'll want mana recoup as your third suffix, otherwise crit damage, a resistance or attribute, or at the very optimal end, item rarity is perfect. For the Anoint, it's hard to beat Pliable Flesh. This dramatically improves the efficacy of your recoup, but is somewhat isolated, requiring 7 points to pick up. Distilled Isolation is much cheaper this season, making this Anoint far more affordable. If you're happy to path to Pliable Flesh and are looking for some more damage, Lasting Trauma in the warrior part of the tree is absolutely huge. 30% increased ignite magnitude while also giving 20% ailment duration makes the build considerably smoother for mapping and bossing. For catalysts, life catalysts are very strong on both rings, but particularly the amulet. Both life and mana recoup are considered life affixes, and all are scaled by flesh catalysts. There is a wildcard here. A corrupted +6 to all fire skills Fireflower amulet would be an interesting choice. That would increase the ignite DPS by about 50% over a rare amulet, but it comes at a cost. First, you lose access to some great defensive affixes on a rare. Secondly, Incinerate procs Fireflower at an incredibly high frequency, and while mapping you might find that you're killing yourself even with soft cap fire res. Thirdly, +5 or +6 Fireflower corrupts are ridiculously expensive, costing 100 divines at time of recording for a +6. Ultimately, the damage you get with Fireflower probably isn't worth the defensive trade-off given you can scale your ignite DPS without it up to around 2.5 million. But if you could stack enough max fire res to avoid killing yourself, the damage would be very interesting to see. Lastly, if you're meeting your gear requirements and have some cash, the build has some solid room for increased item rarity for farming. I'm running 115% increased rarity on my current setup with around 30 divine investment, but if you're willing to go lower, your build will cost far, far less. When I was starting out, I was able to find bargain pieces quite regularly, given these bases aren't as popular and fire skills are currently less meta. Finally for gearing, let's take a look at charms. Charms mostly offer this build some small bonuses, nothing too transformational, especially as we're normally res capped. The best charm for this build is the Forsaken Bangle Amethyst charm. If you recall from our tree, Taut Flesh and Loose Flesh boost our non-chaos life recoup by 15%. The unique effect on Forsaken Bangle, where chaos damage we prevent is recouped over the duration, more than makes up for this. Recouping damage you've negated tends to be extremely powerful, given your chaos res is capped and you negate far more damage than you take. Because Recoup only works against incoming hit damage, incoming dot damage can be very dangerous to this build. So in the second slot, we run a Poison Immunity charm, chosen again because chaos deals double damage to Energy Shield, making this the most dangerous ailment you can be inflicted with. In the third charm slot, I run an Anti-Freeze charm, because I farm a lot of strong boxes, and many of them freeze you upon activation. But getting frozen isn't actually all that dangerous for this build, because you can still recoup life when you're hit while frozen. So an alternative in the third slot could be a Staunching charm to make you immune to bleed for the duration. We'll round out the vid with a look at the Ascendancies and passive tree. First, let's take a look at why we run Chronomancer, a generally unpopular spec. It all comes down to the Rapid River. If this node was on Stormweaver or Infernalist, I'd be playing that spec instead. As stated before in the Recoup deep dive, this node empowers us to face tank all the damage we want to. This pairs very well with Apex of the Moment, stacking your Temporal Chains Curse to keep our enemies moving and attacking at a crawl. The good news is these two are the only passives you need for the build to come online, and arguably only the Rapid River is really required, so if you hate doing Sechamus or Corruption Trials, that's a big plus. The bad news is, none of the other Ascendancies here are all that great. The Chrono's new Unleash Ascendancy doesn't work with channeled skills, and the periodic 50% cast speed from Quicksand Hourglass would let you stack Incinerate more quickly, yes, but it also balloons the mana cost of the spell to a ludicrous degree. As such, the remaining points are pure preference. I'm currently running Now and Again, which lets your blink be used in rapid succession surprisingly frequently, enhancing your mobility while mapping. Blinking into a new pack can be dangerous, even for a build this tanky, so I pair Now and Again with Footprints in the Sand, offering the Temporal Rift skill, letting you quickly back out of any situation you didn't properly account for. As a bonus, it also lets you jump back to the rare who just dropped something shiny a screen back after it was burned and exploded to death off screen. Now, if you really want to drive up the blink mobility, you can go all the way down to Unbound Encore for Time Snap. If you find setup and bosses is annoying, you can go down to Ultimate Command for Time Freeze, giving you around 5 seconds when skill effect duration and temporal chains are accounted for to set up a perfect Incinerate Ignite. None of your possible 3rd or 4th Ascendancies are all that impactful, and I really hope we eventually see a rework to the tree, allowing channeled skills to properly benefit from Chronomancer's unique damage scaling. Your general priorities post level 68 when you can wear Sacrosanctum are to get enough Recoup to feel comfortable, then invest into max energy shield, generic damage increases, and ignite magnitudes. As an ignite build, Joe slots are very powerful, letting you stack 30% overall ignite magnitude, crit damage, and some other useful affix like Recoup. Therefore my current setup paths to 5 different jewels, but 4 is very comfortable at lower levels. Your primary weapon set tree is the one you use to map and to cast your bossing Incinerate. Your secondary tree contains your curse amplification nodes and scales your ball lightning crit chance such that you can easily apply critical weakness and therefore critically hit with Incinerate. After doing so, you'll be able to reach over 80% crit chance with ball lightning, ensuring you refresh your ignites via the total incineration passive. As such, you want to load up your primary tree with damage nodes that you only need when you're casting Incinerate. This frees up your second passive tree to eventually dip into more energy shield nodes, making up for the loss of energy shield on the unique Effigy of Cruelty focus compared to your primary DPS focus. The Soul Bloom passive is absolutely vital, but the points leading you there do absolutely nothing for you. Megalomaniac unique jewels that allocate Soul Bloom tend to be quite cheap, and the chances of getting an affordable one with one or more useful notables is fairly high. I snapped up this one with Soul Bloom and Lasting Trauma for 4 divines, but cheaper ones should be available if you can better use elsewhere the 4 points you'd otherwise use to path to Soul Bloom. You also want total incineration on at least your secondary tree to reset ignites for boss encounters, but the crit damage bonus on the node itself, and the ignite magnitude nodes that you get on the way, mean you ideally want it on your main tree. When you're leveling, the best strategy I've found for consistency is to handle defense via a short recharge delay and fast recharging energy shield with heavy investment. Offensive scaling is handled via generic fire damage multipliers and crit damage multipliers. Before you can recoup energy shield, this is the best way of staying alive through the campaign and early maps. When you hit level 68, you can finally equip Sacrosanctum. We drop all nodes relating to ES recharge rate and ES recharge delay, and take a big chunk of recoup from easily accessible clusters. We can invest in big max ES nodes like Patient Barrier to really boost our max ES without any downside. Now is also the time to fully leverage your weapon set passives. You'll be taking damage with your primary tree. With your secondary, you'll take crit chance and curse magnitude, along with enough extra dex to use Scythe the Spear and Rapid Assault. About this time, you'll notice a huge increase in your survivability and how smoothly you progress through maps. Well, that's about that. Thanks for sticking through the video if you're still here. If you'd like to try it out yourself, I'll be leaving Path of Building links and a Mobalytics guide linked in the video description. And if you do try it out, let me know how you get on or if you find any cool way to improve the build. If you have any questions or I've forgotten to explain anything, please feel free to ask them in the comments. I'll try to answer as many as I can. Once again, I've been Swedge, and I hope you have a great day.